Hello and welcome to the Alabama Public Health Training Network. Thank you for joining us today for our program, Professional Ethics and Values in Contemporary Social Work Practice, Ethical Dilemmas in the Age of Digital and Social Media. If you have a question about anything being discussed today, please call or email during our broadcast. The phone number and email address are on your screen now and will appear again later in the program. Also, the handout, sign-in sheet, and evaluation are all available online. You'll need to register for this program in order to access those materials. Continuing education credits have been approved for social workers for today's program. In order to receive credit for this training, you must watch the entire program, then complete and return the sign-in sheet and evaluation. While content may continue to be relevant, continuing education credit will only be awarded for 2 years, expiring on August 31st, 2018. If you are watching this program on demand and want to receive a social work continuing education certificate, you will need to complete the social work test and send it in along with your sign-in sheet and evaluation. If you are watching this program live, there is no social work test required. I'm Renee Carpenter, State Social Work Director for the Alabama Department of Public Health, and joining me is Jason Newell, Associate Professor and Program Director for the Social Work Program at the University of Montevallo. Welcome, and thank you for being here, Jason.
Thank you, Renee. Renee is also a Montevallo alum.
That's right.
So it's my pleasure to be here. This is my first real-time training, so it's a delight to be here to talk with you about digital and social media and the ethical dilemmas that have been occurring in social work practice, particularly in the last 5 to 7 years with the advent of the social media age. So we have 4 goals that we're going to work on today in our training. The first one is that workshop participants will review an integration of professional values as they intersect with the moral center of self, and also with how our personal and professional values influence our practice with at-risk children and families. You also receive some information on the pragmatic use of social work values in terms of engaging ethical dilemmas with clients and their families. And followed by that, we'll have a discussion of social media and the influence of social media on social work practice, how social work practitioners have engaged social media as a functional tool of social work practice, but also how they've engaged ethical dilemma in terms of contacts with clients. But before we start that, the question tends to come up when I do these trainings. I've had the pleasure of doing trainings now for public health workers today. I've also done trainings for mental health workers and child welfare workers. And the question that tends to raise its head most often is, why are we continuing to mandate continuing education in ethics? We know that the licensure board for the state of Alabama has recently changed their requirement for an ethics CE. Part of that has to do with the continuing ethical dilemmas that have been brought to us with regard to social and digital media, and also because ethical behavior is the foundation for social work practice. So as a professor of social work, when we look at social work education, the Council on Social Work Education actually requires the first practice behavior in our standards is that social workers should identify themselves professionally and engage our profession ethically. So ethical behavior not only influences the lives of vulnerable populations that we serve, it also influences the professional lives of those of us who are providing those services. And public health, like other areas of social work practice, is an ever-evolving practice area, which means we have to shape our practice with regard to the contexts from which we're operating. So we have to shape ourselves. We certainly all in our personal lives probably shaped ourselves to the advent of digital and social media. But now we're finding ourselves in professional positions where we're also shaping our professional practice to engage that. So what this means basically, and in my simple terms, is that ethical dilemmas are more ever present now than they have been in the past, as if that hasn't always been an issue with social work practice. And other professional disciplines are also shaping. So if you look at other licensed disciplines such as nursing, counseling, you'll also find that they are adjusting their context of practice as well. So when we look at this I sort of looked at the mission of the Alabama Department of Public Health and looked at our ethics and social media challenges with regard to the mission of your department, which is to protect individuals and society from disease and to at-risk populations by providing services in disease prevention and family health and other preventative services. So if you look at this from a social and digital media perspective, this can be a great ally to us in our practice. We can advertise services more readily than we've ever been able to before. We're able to launch online applications for social work services where in the past we've not had to do that. But what that complicates things is not all of our consumers have the ability to subscribe to those services readily. So we've really had to think long and hard about adjusting the practice of social work. But before we talk about that, I'd like to talk a little bit about the idea of morals as they intersect with ethics. Sorry, Renee, I'll advance my slide.
That's okay.
So when we think about philosophically why we have morals and ethics and as the driving determinants for social work practice, the definition of moral is really an acquired value of thoughts and feelings that develop for us very early in our lifetime. So if you're a developmentalist, you're thinking about theorists such as Piaget, Kohlberg, and Bandura, and the idea of moral development with parents as our first teachers. So as parents, we start very early in the lives of our children, sort of giving them directives in terms of what a proper moral behavior is. So we point very readily and say, no, you shouldn't do that, and no, you can't do that, and we tend to subscribe to that and hopefully learn from that. And when we look at morals as they drive our professional ethics, I've learned from myself and from my students that our moral system really drives many of us into the profession of social work. So one of the questions I always ask students who are applying to be professional social workers is, as you read the NASW Code of Ethics, do you find that you already subscribe to these values? In other words, did you have social work values before you knew you wanted to be a social worker? And more often than not, almost all the time, the answer is yes. I already had these values. They sync very well for me. I understand these values. I could make a career out of these values. In fact, I want these values to drive my career. So if you think about your morality in terms of your professional ethics, our professional ethics is nothing more than a function of that. It's the duty-bound rules and standards that NASW suggests that we subscribe to. The Alabama Department also has their own ethical code that we subscribe to, and we converge those two together. Because not everyone who practices within the Department of Public Health and in any area of social service is a social worker. We work with nurses, we work with doctors, we work with legal aid, all of which have their own code of ethics and own value systems that they follow. However, sometimes there's a convergence there, and one of the first ethical dilemmas I can remember encountering as a professional social worker was learning that not everyone has social work values, right? Social work values don't always pair with other professional values, and they certainly don't always pair with the values of the other ones around us, even our consumers. So we have to learn that, and that for many of us was our first ethical dilemma and still continues to be an ethical dilemma for us in practice. So as we look at our professional values and the grouping, and if you haven't seen these in a while, this is the NASW Code of Ethics. We learned these very early in our careers as social workers, and they're grouped. So what NASW has done for us as professionals is they've taken those ethical values that we subscribe to as practicing social workers, and they've grouped them for us. And these have remained stable for some time now. If you look at these values, you can see that the number one value, the one that's listed first, if you will, is always service. And behind that is the idea that service comes before all else. What is our job? What are we doing every day? We are going out and we are serving the public. And we're providing a service often to individuals who may not otherwise be able to be a consumer of that service. And behind that is the idea of social justice, which social justice translates, in my mind, always to fairness. Are we able to offer everyone in our society as a civic nation a fair and equal opportunities to subscribe to a service? So while social justice for me is sort of a gray area, it's one of those values that is really hard to define literally, but we always know what it is when we see it, and we certainly know how to identify it when we don't. Right? That's why our consumers come into our office. So the idea of social justice and public health, when I'm working with students, I always give them the example of looking at infants who are newborns. Would you ever want to be in a position where you had two infants and you held one here and said which one gets health care and which one doesn't? No. Social work values suggest that both deserve equal opportunities for a healthy pregnancy, a healthy childbirth, and health care afterwards. But not everyone subscribes to those values. And so I was thinking about with regard to public health and all the services that your department does across the state, and the idea of social justice, that really rings true with the idea of providing services to families and other at-risk populations who may otherwise be unable to consume those services. And if we ever lose sight of the value of social service in our profession, that can lead us down a track where ethical dilemmas become more and more complicated. And if you think about the bottom line, I always suggest our bottom line is at the end of the the day, are we helping people improve their lives? Are the services we're providing helping people improve their lives? Are the outcomes that we're looking for there? The third value is the dignity and worth of all human beings, which goes back to the values of social justice, more like a pyramid, and the value of service. Is everyone deserving of a service? And the answer with regard to social work values is yes. And are they deserving of that service to be provided to the best of our ability? In other words, is an uninsured consumer equally deserving of proper health care as an insured consumer? Because you're uninsured, should you get less quality health care? Social work values tend to suggest no, that everyone is deserving of quality health care, and certainly people shouldn't expire because they can't afford to live. And that's part of the mission of the Department of Public Health, is to provide that, but also at the community level, to provide health-related services that we all consume, such as disease prevention. And when we think about the dignity and worth of all human beings, this tends to be a value that new students in particular struggle with at times, because in theory we all believe that all people are valuable, but often when you're confronted with consumers and some of the challenges of their problems, and I'm a former child welfare worker, so I call myself an unwelcome guest in some homes. So when I knocked on the door, it wasn't always a welcome guest in the home, but we still continued to provide the service, right? We protected the children. As a mental health professional, I see that too. Consumers are not always willing consumers, but we still continue to provide the service because we believe that the value and dignity of human life overrides, right, sometimes even consumer relationships. And in social work, I believe with regard to human relationships, that's the mode. I think that's our vehicle for change. So when we look at human relationships and how we engage consumers, the basis for which we encounter clients and provide services is through our communication, right, and through engaging a client in the helping process. And so in social work, above all else, we have the best impetus for change that exists, which is helping people with regard to their own health, their own lives, the lives of their children, the lives of their family members, and sometimes the lives of their parents and themselves. Right, so we have an opportunity to create change in social work. We have an opportunity to engage human relationships to do that, and we should always capitalize on the opportunity to make human lives better because of our interaction. The last two values, integrity and competence, really have more to do with what we're going to be talking about today, less to do with consumer rights and more to do with our professional ethical responsibility as practicing social workers. The value of integrity just suggests that you're always adherent to the values of our profession, that you're consciously aware of the values of the social work profession, and that you engage those values in the context of your practice. And competence is regard to practice behavior. So if we look at the services that are being delivered, are you delivering the services in such a way that the profession would support the way that those services are being delivered, and in such a way that human lives are being improved through your competent practice? Now, the state of Alabama has the Alabama Board of Social Work Examiners sort of looks at this a little bit differently, and this is more global. So if we look at the idea of being ethically responsible, the way this framework suggests is that above all else, which pairs with the value of service, social workers have a responsibility to their clients. So that's putting the value of service first, operated through social justice. But second, which I find to be very valuable, social workers are responsible to their colleagues. In other words, we're responsible for each other. We're responsible for each other at a micro level, which means practicing ethically within our area, within our department, with our clients, because unethical practice is pervasive and systemic. So if there is an issue of practice or malpractice within a department, that affects all of us. And certainly now, Renee and I were discussing this, in the age of social media, we're under more scrutiny than we've ever been. So I tend to go back to my time as a child welfare worker, and I sort of think about this in terms of seeing all the things that happen that may be perceived as negative in the media versus all the thousands of children we adopt out every year. Which one do we tend to see on media more? We tend to see those negative opportunities, and that's also true for public health, right? I bet you guys are pretty stable until there is a disease issue. Then there becomes the issue, well, what are you doing? And so you sort of feel like, and that becomes a little bit more pervasive now because everyone is linked in such a way that they can read these things in real time. So the days of sort of looking at articles in the newspaper and looking at things retrospectively have long since passed. So we have a responsibility now more than we ever have to each other to protect each other in terms of our practice, and also protect each other by practicing ethically and efficaciously. You also have a responsibility to your agency. And your responsibility to your agency falls now under the purview of the work that you conduct in the office and with regard to digital and social media, the work that you conduct out of office. We're LinkedIn. We're going to talk later in the presentation about being linked into email and to client information, having access to client encounters when you're not on the clock. If you're carrying your phone is technically a computer, that device, for if you're me, is on you at all times, so you're always sort of capable of accessing client information, but that can also be very complicated because clients learn of your availability. So beyond that, if you represent yourself online and you have a social identity and you include the Alabama Department of Public Health as your place of employment, you are representing the Alabama Department of Public Health. So that has also become an issue. And with regard to the profession, you're also responsible to adhering to the values of social work in and out of the office. And that brings us to society, particularly with the Alabama Department of Public Health at the macro level, because you do so much macro level work with regard to disease prevention. So you have to think about not only are you ethically responsible to the department, you're responsible for your social work license, you're responsible for the society in terms of the work that we do. But with that brings lots of challenges. So when we talk about ethical dilemma, I always think of myself maybe when I was a little younger as the person on the left. Can they see this screen?
No.
They can't see the screen. So you can't see my teleprompter. So when we talk about ethical dilemma, that's nothing more than a situation where you are confronted with a practice issue and you feel like there is no right answer. All of us have been confronted with those issues. Can you practically, as a professional social worker, make every constituent happy at all times, every day? No. Are sometimes consumers unhappy with the decisions we make? They are. Are our coworkers sometimes unhappy with the decisions they make? Are the policymakers who are making policy that are driving some of the decisions within our department, can we control that at all times? We cannot. So all of us in social work, or most of us, I would say, have experienced bureaucracy. We work for bureaucratic agencies. Often policies are made that we have no personal influence on at the time. However, we have to learn to practice and thrive within that environment. And that goes back to the context that shape practice. So we are changing our context that shape practice. We're looking at issues a little closer than we used to be because we're being looked at a little closer than we once were. So when you're confronted with an ethical dilemma, the idea is that the social worker is placed in a position where they have multiple options, either working on behalf of a client, a family, or their agency, all of which may have a potentially negative outcome for one or more parties. And I always like to put a little caveat when I do this training for larger audiences, and I always say be prepared for that person to be you. You may very well be the person who's unhappy after you make this decision, even though you know, right, going back to those values. If you're operating under the purview of social justice and you're operating in the best interest of the client and you're making a very difficult decision with regard to that family, you are still practicing social work, right? That's what we're supposed to do. Nowhere in our code of ethics does it say anywhere that everyone has to be happy all the time, right? That's a misnomer. You make decisions based on the well-being of families and you make decisions based on the most ethically sound decision. All right, so when we look at value tensions, the value tensions diagram, so let's look at this, I'm looking at this, I'm sorry, you can see this in your notes page. So when we think about a value tension, this is the idea that your professional self, for me as an educator for years, I was trained to look at values in social work as being sort of pods. So in other words, you have to take your professional values and you leave them in this pod here, and they should never intersect with your moral self. Right? And they should never intersect with your social self or your spiritual self. So we're looking at sort of a four-tier model in terms of value tensions. But our brains don't operate in that way. The idea is that our brain is one organ, right? It doesn't operate in sections. So your professional values are always going to intersect with your moral self. And that brings us back to the idea of our ethics being grounded in moral theory. Morality drives professional practice in such a way that many of us come into the profession based on our moral values. We come into this profession or into the profession of social work because we want to be helpers, because we want to provide services to individuals who may otherwise be unable to consume those services. And basically most of us are in this profession because it's simply the right thing to do. Right? This social work is not a profession that people tend to stay in because they don't think it's the right thing to do. So it's a labor of love. And so we can't separate our moral self from our professional self in such a way that those values don't drive. So it makes sense to me that many of the social work values tend to pair themselves really closely for those of us who choose this profession and sync up with our moral sense of self. There's also the idea of our societal expectations. So what does society expect from the profession of social work? Well, they expect us to do lots of things. I think probably more pronounced, particularly in Alabama, is the idea of child welfare, which I'll tend to go back to. I think many of us tend, because we live in a state where that's necessitated because of our high rates of child poverty, people tend to see social work in child welfare terms, but they forget that we do so many other things. They forget that there are mental health professionals, and they forget that there are public health professionals, and they forget that there are people working within the criminal justice system, all driven by morality-based decision-making. So society tends to hold social work in such a way sometimes where we're seen maybe even some ways negatively and then some ways positively. So it's almost misunderstood sometimes, I think, in terms of what society thinks we should be doing. And as social media has now introduced itself into our layperson lives, we tend to see those incidents highlighted in different ways than we used to, and we tend to see them more readily highlighted. So incidents that at one point may have been handled at a local level are now becoming statewide, and that can be a little bit pervasive. So society's expectations of social work practice, in my opinion, have only increased over the last 5 years. Not because we're highlighting all the wonderful things that our profession is doing to improve the lives of people in Alabama and beyond, but because we're seeing other areas. And then there's a spiritual issue, and when I talk about spirituality in this presentation, it has nothing to do with the construct of religiosity, which is, do you subscribe to a religious base? So, for example, I subscribe to the Christian faith. Spirituality, in terms of what I'm talking about, has to do with, do you feel like you're getting value and meaning from this work? Because that contributes to value tensions sometimes. Do you feel like you're doing the right thing? And that goes back to the ethical dilemma of, when you're working with other professionals, do all professionals subscribe to social work values? The answer is no. Do all citizens subscribe to social work values? No. Does everyone value the work that you do at the Alabama Department of Public Health? No. Do we value that? We do. So we have to really think about that. Because I think more than anything else, in terms of our own integrity and competence, do you feel like you're doing this work for the right reasons, strongly influences your resiliency in the work, right? It empowers your ability to practice ethically if you know you're doing good work all the time. And we've heard a lot about it, and that sort of folds into the self-preservation literature for us. So whether it be a financial burden on a family, would they be able to consume these services that the Department of Public Health is offering if they were insured or uninsured, right? Is it social justice to provide a service for an uninsured family who needs health care, right? Should we be doing this? Is that the right thing to do? Should health care be readily available to everyone in our society? Should we be providing these services to individuals? Are all children worthy of being insured, or should a child go uninsured and untreated because they don't have the opportunity to get a private insurance premium? And in terms of disease prevention and thinking about selection process, how are we distributing those services across in terms of nutrition? And should we be delivering these in terms of disease prevention, nutrition, family planning, and should we be delivering these services in such a way that all people are able to take benefit of that in the state of Alabama? For me, being a social worker of 18 years, and I know that was a mouthful, that is a hard sell for some audiences, right? I think we sort of get used to being in our bubble where everyone subscribes to these values and everyone has a similar belief system, and we sort of operate from that belief system. But if you go outside of the social work profession and you go to other professions and you talk about this and you say, we believe this should be for all people, they're deserving of this just simply because they're a citizen of the United States or a citizen of the state of Alabama, they deserve to have this service, regardless of whether or not they would be able to consume it. That is a hard sell for a lot of audiences. And so I find myself as a professional working with students who encounter this, and I also now in my professional life as an advocate for social work services, find myself encountering the other side of this and hearing the arguments and constantly sort of being in defense of this idea that we owe society, or we owe people in society in some way the ability to thrive within their social environment. And that's very specific to the profession of social work. So when we talk about common ethical dilemmas, and we'll stay here if you're looking at your notes. If you look at the data with regard to licensed professions, and you look at social work across the state, so a study was done recently on licensing data and looking across states at both the baccalaureate level and at the master's level, and looking at the number of reported incidents for social work malpractice. It should be no surprise that boundary relationships is the #1 most frequently reported issue of malpractice. And we should also point out as a scientist that this is in fact a cross-section. So we're really only looking at the number of reports that are made. This is not the total number. So you're looking at just the thumbnail. So these are the ones that actually get reported to licensing boards at the state level. So if we look at the issue of boundary relationship, and I'm used to having an audience, so why do you think that boundary relationships is #1? What do we do? Work with
people.
Build relationships. And going back to that idea of the inherent value and worth and dignity of all human beings and human relationships being what drives our practice, we work with human beings. And do we work with human beings who are often in very homeostatic, stable human existence? No. Those people, I learned that those individuals do not have social workers. I have those conversations with students sometimes. If you're looking for a client who is in a stable home and everything is homeostatic and the food issues are resolved and everyone's in school and there's no abuse or neglect and there's no mental health issue, those people don't have social workers, right? It's the individuals who are suffering from social problems that come into our offices and who are seeking services. So in order to deliver those services, there has to be a human relationship. We have to engage a client. We have to have a conversation. So human service work is inherently stressful in this way because we are in the business of working with human beings. And with that, we often see human beings who are in their worst state of existence. Also, I've learned that people tend not to come into a social worker's office proactively. It's tertiary. It's after the incident has occurred. So in other words, I'm in crisis. I am now in desperate need of service. Could you help myself or my family and provide them with a service that we need to continue to thrive? So boundary relationships are inherently involved in social work practice. And if we look at this across other licensed professions, so if we looked at the data in medicine, the data in nursing, the data in the legal field, the data in the counseling literature, and the data in the clinical psychology literature, boundary and relationship issues is almost unanimously #1 if we look at licensing. So I think the good news is it's not just us. If that could be considered good news, it's not just us. It's working with people is stressful. When you have to create relationships to provide healing services, that is stressful. And it also creates a conduit for the exchange of human energy, right? And often that involves the exchange of human emotion. So not only are we communicating with our clients, we're with them at a point where they're fragile, where they need healing services. They need services that are going to make their lives better, and there's a vulnerability there. So boundary issues, and I think sort of looking at this pragmatically, this is not something that's ever going to leave our profession. It is, in fact, something we just have to learn to work with. However, as we start to talk about the advent of the digital and social media age, we've learned that boundary relationships have now become even more so difficult to maintain because the availability of personal data is so much more ready than it used to be at some point. It's really hard to go home at 5 o'clock now and be anonymous from everyone in the world, whereas 10 years ago it was very reasonable to do that. And when Renee and I were talking a little earlier before I did this, one of the issues that's been the most confronting with this is that there's a generational challenge that exists. And I sort of used myself as an example and said I can remember 10 to 15 years ago being that person who was technologically savvy, who knew how to operate within a computerized world and who knew how to exchange virtually and who knew how to go online and do research. And now I'm finding myself a generation behind. So now I find that consumers know things that I don't know. Right, so we've moved forward, and most of us are in this sort of centered age group right now, where there's a generation behind us that's very technologically savvy, and a generation ahead of us that's very not. And so we're sort of sandwiched in, and some of our senior members of our social work agencies have real challenges with engaging technology in that way. But I also can say that I can remember anecdotally going home from my job at 5 o'clock without a computer in my hand, call the phone now, and actually leaving the work, whereas now it's become so much more difficult to do that. And that has increased boundary issues and boundary relationships across all social service providing agencies in this country. The second most challenging ethical dilemma for social workers is the idea of self-disclosure. So let's think about this not in our old terminology, which means I always think of self-disclosure in terms of a session. Coming from also being a mental health professional, thinking about what is an appropriate amount of self-disclosure within a therapeutic session. And the general rule for me has always been as little as possible. Let's focus the session on the consumer. If they ask you a direct question and you're comfortable answering it, that's fine, but there comes a point where a session can be flipped. Now let's think about that in terms of social media. How do we self-disclose in a social or virtual space? How do we do that? Do you ever find yourself shopping and a question pops up and you hit OK? Is that not your self-disclosure? And I think this may be overly cautious, but when you put in a website and you enter any sort of personal information into that website, no matter what it is, you're by virtue of that self-disclosing or giving your permission, right, for that information to be available. Right? So when we think about that in terms of clients and their behaviors, what is an appropriate amount of self-disclosure in a digital or virtual environment? It's become a little bit more difficult for us to engage that because it's no longer, the idea of self-disclosure no longer rests in the office like it used to. And there's also the idea of client privilege. How much information is a client privy to in terms of their confidentiality and their anonymity? So client privilege, the basis from which we practice social work, how I learned it, is that client information is always confidential, right? And anonymity is a part of our business. So often that complicates things because when there are news reports, right, we can't always address what's going on in social media because of confidentiality and anonymity. There's also the idea of looking at client data offline, or out of the office. So could you Google a consumer's name? Can you do that? Is there any would the social work police come and arrest you if you Googled a client's name? Probably not. There's no steadfast policy. There is no policy that says you cannot do that. In fact, I would say that as someone who's involved with searches at a university level in HR, we do that. But when something goes in a virtual space or a public space, it, by virtue of that, becomes available to the public. And so I think we're sort of not as aware of that for many years. And so thinking about client privilege, if we're looking at client information and we're Googling clients, it becomes an ethical issue because there is no steadfast. The idea of ethics, I think, for most of us is that it lies somewhere between policy and the law, right? And it's what you should do versus what the policy may say you can't do. And if there isn't a policy, it's really hard to regulate virtual space because what people do outside of the office, right, is done outside of the office, but yet we can still link in to clients and their information outside the office. So the idea of client privilege has become quite an issue, especially if, from a therapeutic perspective, if you were to access information about a client that a client didn't disclose to you within a said session, then that could influence your interpretation of the client's information. Right? So it can influence your interpretation of what they're delivering to you. It could also influence your interpretation of what you should do in terms of being a quality service provider. And with regard to mandated reporting, I covered this. I mentioned earlier that I had done this training for child welfare workers. Really in Alabama, we're all mandated reporters. We have a good citizenship law here. But in terms of social work, we are all mandated reporters, which means if we know a client is in harm's way, then we are, by law or by policy, suggest that we should make a report or empower a report, which means you either report yourself or you make sure the report is done by some other means. And if we're looking at mandated reporting issues and the idea of social media, how should we respond to something that we see not in our office in real time, but on a virtual space? Are we still a mandated reporter? Well, the policy is very gray. You're always a mandated reporter. Above all else, you're a mandated reporter. That's part of being a social work professional, or really being in the presence of any vulnerable population. But how do you negotiate that? So as I was working with other professionals in the state, I learned that reports are actually going up in mental health agencies. They're going up in child welfare agencies. I don't know if that's true also in public health, but we're hearing more reports of incidents because people are responding to things that are online. And how do we engage that as a profession? Is this still considered a client issue? Is this still considered a client emergency? Should we still be notifying? Because the idea of empowering a report, if a client is in distress and they're in your presence, then you can mandate the report, right? If you know a client's homicidal or suicidal, you could do something right then in real time. But if not in real time and you're in a virtual space and you have a sense that the client could be in harm's way, you have to empower a report. They're not with you. Does that make sense? So this has become a real issue across the literature, particularly in the suicidality literature, because now people are also reporting information and disclosing information online through virtual spaces, through apps, through chat rooms, through blogs, that if a professional who's responsible in some way, even if you're not seeing the client directly, you're still considered a mandated reporter. So in terms of child abuse and neglect, even though you may not be seeing that client as part of a practice, or if you're a public health professional, you're not in child welfare practice at all, if you witness child abuse, you're still mandated as a reporter, correct? But if it's an online issue, right, if you have a sense, or people, I've learned, and myself and through other people I've worked with, if people know you're a social worker, they sometimes assume you're all-knowing. So I learned, I feel that I have a sense that someone might be doing something inappropriate or wrong. What should I do? Right? And here's my phone. I saw this on Facebook. So it's sort of interesting, the kinds of complaints that we're seeing at that level. And that also falls into our duty to warn. And if you think about the idea of thinking about ethical dilemma, informed consent is also an issue too. So looking at the idea of pushing out. So if clients are putting information online, they're giving their consent for it to be out there, but is it really ethical practice for us to access and look at it if it doesn't have any bearing or relevance on the case? So it's very interesting. Gift accepting. This has become an interesting issue, not so much in social work, I find that social workers are not overwhelmed with gifting from clients. I think that the audience is laughing. You can't see it, but I can. This is not an issue for us. However, it has become an issue in other state of Alabama agencies like public schools. So if you look at teachers and gifting teachers, there have been incidents at the education department where certain counties have said we're not going to allow this because it could be considered that you might favor one student over another if there's a gifting issue. So gift accepting for us is on the low end of this continuum for a reason. There's also the issue of record keeping. This is my example of how becoming digitized has actually helped us do our work. I mentioned earlier that there are generational challenges, and I'm looking at my audience, and I feel like we're chronological peers. So all of us can remember having to do a handwritten narrative. All of us can remember having to take a form and check all the boxes, and all of us can remember having to code our services and track the codes and make sure they were entered correctly so that we could bill correctly. Now, as we become more digitized and computerized in terms of our services, we're able to do that now more efficiently. We're able to do it more quickly. I saw an eye roll. It helped me as a mental health professional to have a system that would actually flag me and go, hey, Jason, you forgot to enter this code. This is, and not have to wait till the paper trail circled back around. And so I think that record keeping in some ways has become better. We can keep records better than we used to. However, it has complicated things too. So there's this idea that, well, we have this new great efficient system, so you should be able to do this more quickly. So now the expectations for record keeping have actually gone up, and the productivity expectations have actually gone up. But no one's really accounted for the idea that clients have remained stable. So it takes the same amount of time to do things that it's always taken, but yet there's an expectation at some level for us to generate the documentation quickly and more effectively. And I think that's not just of social work. We sort of see this in all agencies and even outside of the human services, particularly in the business world. The expectation is to do work quick, and the expectation is to work fast, and the expectation is to work efficiently. But the ethical challenge is we should never be expeditious when it comes to the lives of human beings, right? We should never get caught up in the idea that we need to be expeditious in our record keeping. We don't need to be egregious in our record keeping in any way. We need to always document encounters, and that's a way for you to protect yourself in practice. But you also don't want to lose the humanistic part of our humanistic profession, which is taking the time to really work with clients. And for me, doing handwritten narrative was always an opportunity to really sort of document that and sort of, going into the art of documentation versus now when we're behind screens, it's a little bit different, right? So the note-taking process is a little different. And so that's become an issue with some agencies with regard to keeping accurate records because you can't always capture a client's life in a digitized encounter where you're checking a box. Right? So if you're really looking at the qualitative components of social work narrative, it's really hard to glean sometimes within a computerized system. So I'm not a public health social worker. I should have made that disclosure ethically at the beginning. The audience has probably caught on that I have a history in child welfare and mental health. So I don't know exactly what the life of a public health social worker is, so I don't know how computerized our system is. So I'm just sort of linking it to, I think, the commonalities that I'm getting from the other state departments.
It's very computerized.
Very computerized. Very good. Thank you, Renee. So right now, I think it would be a good point for us to sort of take a pause and see if our audience has a question.
Anybody have anything?
We'll move forward.
Okay.
No questions? All right. So I think we're going to go and backtrack just a little bit in the notes, because the way I had this session framed, Renee, was that we would go through common ethical dilemmas for social workers, then we'd take a 5-minute break.
Okay.
So I think that what we can do here is we can allow our break to occur a little bit early, and we'll segment into the next series of commentary, which probably will take a little longer. So I think that would be good in terms of my time frame. It also will allow us an opportunity at the end to take questions from our very small audience, and I understand an opportunity for calls to come in. So
Right.
we'll free up a little
That's
more
right.
time.
So I want to remind our viewers that the phone number is appearing on your screen. So if you have a question, you can phone it in, or you can also email it in. So we'll take about a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back for the rest of this program. I want to welcome you back to our program, or the second half of our program, and also want to remind our audience that if you have any questions, the phone number is on your screen now, so feel free to call in or email those questions. So, Jason, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Renee. And for the second half of our ethics presentation today, we're going to talk about digital and social media and practice with vulnerable clients. And Renee suggested that this was where most of the interest, and we found that to be true across our state agencies, that this has become such a problem for many state and local social service agencies, that a lot of time and effort has gone into how we should operate. And one of the things that the data suggests at this point, which is unfortunate, is that there are no really concrete policies that suggest how we should and should not operate within a virtual space. There are specific policies for some organizations, and there are specific policies that are created in-house for social service organizations, but we've yet to really come up with a generalized policy that's blanketed across either state or federal agencies, nor has NASW come up with a concrete set of standards by which we should operate within a technological or digital or social media space. The last standards that NASW created were created in 2010, which is about 6 years old. So as you all know, we've changed exponentially with regard to the number of digital and social media encounters that we make daily within the last 6 years. And part of that is that social work has sort of been left in a stalemate, because it's really hard to regulate behavior in unregulated space, which means when you leave the office, do we have any responsibility to each other, remember, to the agency, to the state, to the community, and to ourselves as practitioners to regulate our behavior within our online space? So when we talk about social media and the influence of that on vulnerable clients, I put my phone on the table for a reason, not because I want the social network during the presentation, but because I wanted to do a visual. We're social workers, so we're all visual. We're taught to assess sort of at the visual level first. And this is very deceptive in terms of how much information can actually be held in a device. So I think going back generationally, so sort of thinking about the idea of having a record. Has anyone ever, I'm sure in my audience there are those of us who remembers when records were paper. Some of them were quite large. I had records that were multiple binders. And so if you think about, in your head what it would be like to carry around 3 or 4 client binders, right, times 25 or 30 cases, it'd be very difficult for us to do that, correct? But yet we do that with this. So it's a lot of deceit there in how much real personal information can be stored in a device, and our access to that. It used to be that records rarely left the office, if at all, that they were property of the state. They stayed within our compounds. They stayed locked. Do you remember double lock and key? correct? So that we have access entry codes now that serve as the old double lock and key. So that's your login information. That's the metaphorical representation of that. But the hard files were always under double lock and key. We kept them in our offices, or we kept them in a file room that was locked. But now it's so much easier to access that information. So that is one issue that we're facing, is that if we're accessing client information, even though you have digital access to it, if it's done after 5 o'clock or when you're not officially working for the agency, is that considered an ethical dilemma? So if a client sends you an email and you access their information and respond to that after 5 o'clock, is that considered good practice? Is that considered efficient practice? Or is that considered something that could be handled at 8 o'clock the next morning or within normal business hours? So we'll just sort of go down this list and talk about each one of these individually. So the point at this stage is that we don't have a lot of hard, steadfast policy with regard to networking within a virtual space, either in or out of the office. But we do know that if we go back to our values, and we sort of look at the value of human relationships and what that means to being a practicing social worker, we do know that there is, in fact, potential for harm when there is lack of face-to-face interaction. So let's go back and think about our training. How do we do client assessments, right? Remember, so we're visual, right? So we're looking at visual behaviors. We're, engaging a client and sort of looking at the way they dress, the way they act, how they're sitting, their level of communication. Can they communicate at all? Their state of distress. Is this client in crisis? But we're seeing in other professional disciplines, social work included, where now online or virtual encounters are considered practice, particularly in the mental health field. So can we do counseling or a therapeutic intervention online? I can still see your face. I will tell you that the licensing board in this state has recently, I'm trying this, and I'll say reluctantly, but I'm going to be now that I'm middle-aged, I'm going to respond to the generational challenge. I am reluctantly doing an online supervision session with a licensee for the first time. So our licensing board has said, where it used to be there was a face-to-face interaction, or you went to a licensing group and you need to see the face of the licensee, because that's how you engage whether or not that person was really able to embrace the ideas and the values and the practices of social work. Whereas now we can do that online, and we're seeing other agencies, we're doing meetings online, right? So we now are doing meetings online. We're doing this training, right, online. It used to be that I would have to come to you individually, or you'd have to come to me. So there are positives and there are negatives, and we have to learn to find the healthy balance, sort of always looking as true social work professionals for where is that homeostatic state. But I would say in general, I think in terms of client encounters, I do think that there's potential for harm, and I think that potential for harm, in fact, increases when there is a lack or there's an absence of face-to-face interaction. I think we lose some of the essence of practice when we don't see our clients face-to-face. General encounters, email encounters, corresponding with offices, but you have to really think about that. I find myself on a daily basis when I go to state meetings introducing myself to people and going, it's so nice to see you face-to-face, because I have a virtual relationship with that person. Renee and I had a virtual relationship. We know people online, we social network, we engage each other, we do business online, and we never see face-to-face. And do you often find yourself going, I feel like I know this person so much better now? So we encountered that. It's a common, and I also find myself, and I'll self-disclose, appropriate amount of self-disclosure, that I'm very inclined to send an email to someone whose office is 2 doors down from me. Right? So I do think, and I also find myself at times thinking, well, if we're really communicating and we're doing business and we lose the face-to-face interaction and we're defaulting to email and we're defaulting to text messaging or we're defaulting to some other medium, you can lose the essence of what you're trying to communicate, and you also can confuse the essence of what you're trying to communicate. So an emotion can be interpreted from a text message, where if someone was face-to-face, it'd be a little different, right? So we find that, and we also want to make sure if that can happen in our offices, that if we're doing virtual encounters with clients, they're even more so at risk. There's a risk for misinterpretation of client data, and there's also a risk for clients to misinterpret your service. Right? If you're not seeing them face to face, if you're not there to say no, you've misunderstood what I've said. And that goes back to establishing strong client boundaries. Remember, number one, when we looked at ethical dilemma, was a boundary relationship. So it can be very confusing if you're networking with a client or treating a client, so to speak, providing services to a client, intervening with their family within a space where you're not having a face-to-face interaction. So, just caution as we're looking at that. And also caution in terms of our own. Remember, we're responsible to our colleagues in addition to our clients. So as we're networking with each other within our occupational space, one of my mentors did suggest to me a long time ago, and I've always remembered this, and she would say, the moment there's an ounce of emotion conveyed in your writing, back away. Right, because if you can see it, then someone else can too, and they can lose that interpretation, and that can only complicate a work environment, which eventually goes back to clients and their services. So just think about that I am so apt to do that, and I consider myself to be behind this generation. So I'm thinking futuristically because I'm a social work professor, so I'm training the next generation of social workers, how little attention sometimes they pay to the face-to-face interaction. So we have to go back to those basic skills that those of us who are chronological peers know, which is if you need to communicate something and it's important, often it's most helpful to do that face-to-face. And that's true with clients as well, sort of looking at clients face-to-face, doing your ongoing assessment of their needs, doing your ongoing assessment of their behavior, and doing an ongoing assessment of what you need to do as a practitioner to intervene with them in real time. Not in virtual time, not in delayed time, and not over a virtual space. I also think in terms of us protecting our licenses, that if we engage clients through email or through text messaging or another form of communication, their interpretation of that leaves us liable, right? Because they always come back. And I've learned that with regard to boundary relationships, there is no ethics board that I've ever read about that's going to suggest that client had really poor boundaries. Who does that always come back to? The social worker. The client may have poor boundaries, but it's our job to know what the limits of those boundaries are. And it is always our job as a professional to establish a clear boundary with a client. Right? That is our job to recognize inappropriate behavior. And inappropriate, I always say that's one of our favorite words in social work. It's one of those words where no one really knows what that means, but you know it when you see it. Right? So inappropriate versus appropriate. We love to say that in this profession. But when you recognize a client who may have an inappropriate boundary, it is always, always your job to establish that boundary. And often, the boundary issues are more clearly communicated face-to-face. Right? So an online boundary could be even bigger risk. We also look at the idea of sensitive information. I alluded to that when I pointed to my phone. I have access to sensitive data. Your phone, even though it's not on, so this is where the issue has become. If you're on your computer that's owned by the state of Alabama, right, that's owned by us, by taxpayers. They pay for that machine for you to do your work. Right, so you subscribe to HIPAA. FERPA, by the way, is the university's version of HIPAA, which means basically, even though mama's paying the tuition, unless I have a form, just like you guys, that says I can disclose personal information. If you call and say, how's so-and-so doing in my class, I cannot confirm or deny that your student is sitting in that seat. And talk about some strong conversations that I've had. I've also had those conversations when I was in practice with spouses. How's my husband doing? Or how is my wife doing? Or I don't have a HIPAA form for you, right? So I can't disclose this information at this time. And so we have to really think about that. And sensitive information is stored here. It's stored in your machine that's owned by the state of Alabama. You turn it off when you leave to go home, but this is owned by you, right? Unless you have a state phone. Some of us have state phones. I do not. I have a personally owned phone, which means I am personally responsible in every way for every communication that occurs through this device that's related to my professional practice, whether it's with you, whether it's with a student, whether it's with another professional who's a social worker in the state or with another state agency. That falls on me, right? And if it's done after hours, it falls on me even more so. So if I'm networking in a meeting with other professionals and we're all on the same page, you're sort of held under the auspice of your agency. But once you're off the clock, so to speak, once you're clocked out and you go home, then you are solely responsible for the information and the networking that you do if it relates in any way to the business of the state of Alabama. And we have to think about it in that way. I want us to all, always be ever present of social work values, always be ever knowledgeable and competent of why we're in this profession, which is to do the right work, to make people's lives better. But never, ever lose sight of that we are, in fact, in a business, right? And we're in the business of helping, all right? And so we don't want to capitalize social work services in any way. We can't do that, right, because we work on zero budgets. But what we can do is treat consumers with the dignity and respect that they deserve, which often sometimes is establishing a clear and conscious boundary, right? No, I cannot return your email after 5 o'clock. If it's an emergency, I find myself saying this to students all the time. If it's an emergency, We have fail-safes for that, right? That's why we have on-call. That's why we have hotlines that you can call. Right? If it's an emergency, that's one thing. If it's a general correspondence, that's another. And in fact, it could be suggested if you're generally corresponding with a client after hours that that's in fact unethical, and that's a boundary issue. It goes back to one of the basic values of client services, which is to empower a client, right? To get a client to understand, to learn, to operate on their own, not with the constant support of a social worker. It's a disservice, right, to train clients to be dependent on us or to be dependent on the system in any way, right? Clients need to learn to problem solve on their own, right? How many times have you thought that in your practice? So I'm going back, and having those conversations and, thinking about all the clients over 18 years that I've worked with and how often I've said, I'm happy to be your social worker. I want to do this practice, but you have at some point got to learn I can't be with you forever. Right, and that goes back to this. And so we're thinking about those dependency issues. And within an office setting, guilty, with my wife, she would point this out very quickly, that I'm very apt to return those emails from colleagues after hours. They don't have to be returned. It is almost never an emergency, but it becomes an issue of efficiency and sometimes an issue on my part to just get the work done in the moment, in real time, and make it go away. Whereas if you let something sit overnight, you never know. Sometimes the response is a little better. So I'm sort of thinking about that. It's sort of the need for us to be in real time and be efficient in real time, but also sort of that drive for consumerism, for efficacy, for fast practice, for delivery immediately, sort of looking for that immediate response. Text messaging has led us to that space too, right? So now you can correspond. You don't actually have to have a personal conversation, so it's less invasive, right? Because you're not calling and communicating one-to-one, but you are sending a correspondence maybe to a colleague and wanting an answer for something in real time that could be tabled. So if you think about that holistically, it's become quite an issue. Not everyone being proficient in a virtual world. So what about our consumers? I think of, we have a lot of information online. We can access information readily. I can find forms for the Alabama Department of Public Health online. I can resource my clients to those forms, to that data, to look at the helpful information that you have posted online. But what if I have clients who don't have access to a device in any way? What if a client is an aging client who's never had a home computer and has never been online and who doesn't know how to access information other than a one-to-one interaction? So the value of that is, yes, if I wanted to find out information about all the services that are provided by the Department of Public Health, I could do that. And I can do that fast. I can do that now. I can do that sitting here. I could talk to a student about all the services that are available. I could do education in front of my screen. But the flip side of that in terms of providing consumer services is not everyone's going to have that capability. And I think I mentioned earlier in the presentation that now I'm starting to feel my age a little bit because this generation is so advanced in comparison to where I was when I started college. I started college with no computer. Most people didn't have a personal machine. We had labs and we had spaces available to go work, and we went to a library that was a building that we walked into as opposed to an online database that we get a subscription to. The world has changed, and I'm not storytelling and saying that I'm so old I can't remember that, but we have to change too. So we're going to have to meet this generation where they are, but also not leave anyone behind, because at some point, you guys know as developmentalists, it is really going to be us. Right, we're going to be the aging consumer. So I have to think about that in terms of future practice and raising this generation of social workers. So if we have clients who don't have the capability or the skill set or the financial resources to access services virtually or even access information about services virtually, we still need to be practicing social work. We still need to be doing case management. That's why those face-to-face visits are important. That's how we learn that clients don't have access to resources. That's how we get those resources in those homes. That's how we learn if clients and their families are vulnerable by doing that face-to-face assessment. So let's not lose sight of that, because it's easy to do that in a virtual world. Credentialing and misuse of social media by non-qualified professionals. This has raised its head in the literature quite frequently within the last 5 years. The idea is, and going back to my background in mental health, and again, I'm not a public health social worker, so I'll talk about what I know best, which is mental health. And the idea of having a life coach. Well, what does that mean? Can anyone be a life coach? And the answer is yes. Is that you have to have there is no degree, so you can't get a degree. There's no certification that I'm aware of. Perhaps there is. There's no program from which you graduate where you're a life coach. So what that suggests to me is that a layperson could be providing social work type services or mental health like services or public health like services to someone without any professional training. And the idea of credentialing within a public auspice, so if you're applying for a job at the Department of Public Health and they're wanting to look at your degree and they're wanting to see BSW, MSW, MPH, RN, BSN, we can credential that. We have credentialing specialists who can go online. The Social Work Licensing Board has all of our licenses in a database. You can search myself, Renee, other social workers by name, find out if they're in fact who they say they are. But if you're someone who's not trained to do that, social workers are trained to seek out professional. They're trained to document information. They're trained to ask questions. But if you have a layperson who doesn't know the difference between a professional public health worker and a life coach, right, who's giving nutrition advice, who's giving dietary advice, who's giving healthy pregnancy right services, but not under the protection of our department, then that becomes a big issue. So this generation, I think, is what we're seeing as sort of the flip side of that. So while we, on one end of the spectrum, have maybe an aging generation that's not going to be as proficient or savvy within an online environment, we have a growing generation that's almost trained to seek out resources on their own through digital and social media and access them readily. So if you look at, looking at things like WebMD, and I often use the example with my clients. You could enter in, a stomach ache, you're sweaty, you've got a headache, you're feeling tired, you have, all these health concerns, and you could enter it in, and you could have fatigue, you could have a hangover, or you could have cancer, right? So we don't want to introduce chemotherapy for a hangover, right? Even though the symptoms are similar, right? Even though they seem to be the same, even though, right, you need an appropriate provider to, one, make that assessment for you, to diagnose the condition and provide an appropriate treatment, not an online diagnostic resource. In mental health, we shouldn't be defaulting to DSM online to make our assessments. That's part of our face-to-face interaction, right? And you can lose the essence of the practice there. You can lose the value of the communication there, and sometimes you can lose the indication if you're not practicing ethically. But I think this generation, more often than not, and students will tell me this in my classroom, I've got A, B, C, and D, and I looked online, and now I know I have this. You don't, unless you've seen a qualified professional who has assessed your situation, who has diagnosed and documented your situation, and who has prescribed an appropriate treatment, then all you're doing is reading information online. But I think we're sort of trained to do that, and I know myself, so we've become what I would call an information glutton. We want the answer now, right? We want to find the answer now. If you have a health issue, I'm telling you, I have a small child. If she has a health issue, that's where I'm going to go. I'm going to go look at it, even though I shouldn't do it, because that's only going to confuse me right before we see a qualified professional to make the right diagnosis. It only makes me nervous and anxious, but yet we're seeing this more and more and more. And certainly, if someone who is untrained, as professionals, we know if we're looking at a source of information, if it comes from the National Institute of Health, that's a viable source. That's considered a resource for us. That's good information. It's regulated by the federal government, right? National Institute of Mental Health is regulated by the federal government, right? Nothing's going to go on that site that's not quality information. But all other web information that's not validated by a body that's considered a scholarly body is just information. So we have to be really careful about that. And we also have to be careful about educating our consumers about where to find the best information, right? Reading someone's blog about their experience is not considered quality assessment. It's great. I guess it's good quality, but maybe bad. Good quantity, but maybe bad quality. So the quantity of the information might be rich. You can find 1,000 hits for any one search phrase. But really looking for the quality, what is the best, right? That can be more difficult to do. And I always say that the best is a face-to-face interaction with a qualified provider who's trained to provide a service for the condition. Electronic disclosures. This becomes more of an issue, probably not so much in public health. I think probably we electronically disclose all the time, and now we've become so desensitized to electronic disclosure that we sort of overlook it. And if you're shopping online and you're entering your credit card information, the moment you hit that button to buy that, you're disclosing to whoever you're purchasing that material or supply from to have access to your data, right? You're giving them that information when you hit enter. So again, it's very deceiving, where it used to be that you would actually have, and I can remember this, we actually had to give the card up and they had to run it, and it was a piece of paper and you had to sign it, and there was a real interaction there, and if something did happen, you knew the person that did it, and you could go back and ask them a question later or return the merchandise. Those days have long since sort of evaporated. And it's different, and it's sort of going by the rule of looking at something that used to be a human interaction. So when you disclose, it's different if I gave the person my credit card out of my wallet. I'm giving it to them in their hand. So I'm disclosing. I'm giving them permission to use this information, to enter it into whatever database to pay for the product, versus doing it online where there's so much anonymity and you don't know who's behind there and you don't know who's got access to your information. So where the big issue is now is consumers often aren't aware of this. Right? They aren't aware. They're entering information, sometimes very generously into websites where they can be violated in any number of ways. But also our minors are very desensitized to that. So if you have children of your own, they're growing up in a generation where they're very accustomed to interacting with people, even with regard to the purchase of product, who are invisible to them. So the old, sort of idea, I think, in the workplace, if you're going in and you're entering information, even if it has to do with any state business, you should be very cautious. Even if it's putting your name and the fact that you work for the Alabama Department of Public Health, you should be very cautious about entering that information because you're giving the public permission to source that. You're giving the public permission to look at that information. And as a personal sort of disclaimer, you should be very cautious about monitoring your own online identity and the amount of information that you put out personally. And this may be a little overly cautious. I still have some child welfare hypervigilance, but I can remember working with consumers and now thinking back, we didn't have that luxury then. I just went out and found people's homes without a phone and just a sense of responsibility and spent the rest of the day finding my way back if I needed to do that. But I clearly can remember working with consumers that I would not want to have access to my personal information, not pictures of my child or my home. And now that's so much more difficult to do. And so you really have to think about that, because once something goes into a virtual space, if you put it there, you're giving that space permission to document that picture, to document that information, to document whatever you say. That is your disclosure, right? You're entering in by proxy of that. So the fail-safes are really hard now because we've gotten so accustomed to, even when something, how many times have you said, "Are you sure?" If you go on, for me, if you go on in any lobby in any airport and they offer free Wi-Fi, you jump online immediately and start working, right? As efficiency, time management, you've got to use this time waiting on the plane to get so many emails done, but just be very, very cautious that those are not protected areas. So if someone were savvy enough, they could be watching what you're doing, which most of the time does not mean much. It's your personal email. Maybe it's a work email, but it also means if you're using client information, if you're emailing someone with a private email that's your supervisor or someone else's supervisor, that could actually be accessed. So just be careful about that. I'm with everyone else that I've had to learn as we've moved along, and I'm very apt to accept and move forward. And the idea is that most of the time it's okay, but you should never lose, sort of the sight of the fact that it couldn't be, and be very cautious about that. And I sort of monitor the quality of the email. If I just need to email, my spouse and say I'm fine, that's something I wouldn't mind anybody knowing. But if it's a detailed email that has to do with a work situation, that I wouldn't walk up to someone who doesn't know me and tell them that face-to-face, or if I wouldn't want my supervisor to know in a face-to-face conversation, or if I'm not ready to have a conversation with a client and I need to ask my supervisor how to engage that client, if you wouldn't do it face-to-face, you might be really cautious about putting it in a space where other people can see it. If you're in the office, though, you're protected. Right? And so that sort of goes back to my generational mind, thinking about it was a little bit easier when we just turned the computers off and got in our cars and went home, because that was our protection. Right? We didn't have the ability to do that at certain points in this profession. But now we've sort of grown into now where we have the ability to stay linked in to our professional network at all times. So be very careful about that. And thinking about online or text encounters, is it considered best practice or accountable practice or practice at all? So we have to really think about that, and that's very agency specific. It depends on the encounter. Some agencies are allowing online encounters. Mental health is one of the first areas of practice to go into that. Social work has been a little less resistant, I will say that, for those of you who are watching from our side of the house. Counseling has moved into that, where encounters can be made. You can bill a client for an hour of online interaction. So you can have a session one-to-one, I guess, well, virtually one-to-one. You can see a face, and you can bill a client. You can also, which I think has become a huge issue, is if you can see clients across state lines, which becomes a licensing issue. So if I'm seeing a client in Georgia, but I'm licensed in Alabama, and they're sitting in Georgia having the session, but I don't have a Georgia license and there's not reciprocity, and if there was reciprocity, I haven't applied for reciprocity, is that considered, how liable am I? So these are the kinds of things that are coming up in the literature. And beyond that, as sort of an old school person, if a client goes into crisis and they're suicidal and they're not with me, right? If they're with me, I can protect them. And if they leave my office, I can call law enforcement and I know that they've left my office. If they're not with me and it's a virtual encounter and they're in another state or even in another city or even across town, could I get to them if they went into crisis, right? And then that falls back. So we started early on talking about issues with mandated reporting, issues with our duty to warn, issues with our mandate as social workers to protect clients at all costs and put service first. So if we're putting service first, is this the best way? So it's a real ethical dilemma. Is it best to provide the service to the client online if that's the only way they can consume it, or is it best to mandate that there be a face-to-face interaction? And there's no policy that says one way or the other at this point. It becomes up to either the agency's discretion to dictate or the professional's discretion, particularly if they're private practitioners. So that's really sort of surfacing itself in the mental health literature. So it's food for thought. I had not thought about it in that way until I attended a conference and this was coming up. And so there have been suicidality issues, and there have been, and the practitioner that gave the qualitative sort of story that happened to them was, I felt, all I could do was give them the 1-800 number. Well, to me, that's not enough, and that's what I said. And I said, that's not enough. That's something I give a client preemptively, right? If you can't get in touch with your social worker or you're alone and you can't, then you call this number. But if I'm with you in a session, then it becomes my responsibility. And more than that, if you go back to the intersection where we talked about where your professional values intersect with your moral values, you remember there was a spiritual value there? Do you feel like that's the right thing to do? How would you feel if a client did go into crisis or they were hurt or they hurt someone else and there was not a face-to-face interaction but you had knowledge, right? What is that going to do to you in terms of your view of your professional efficacy and of your personal efficacy? So there is sort of an intersection there, and we have to think about that harder. And it used to be that the encounters were a little easier because we were doing so much face-to-face encounter. We were doing, email was an office dialogue, or if you were out of town, you could do some work, but it wasn't actually going into the idea of serving clients in such a way. So if you think about online or text encounters as best practice, at this point, I would say no. I don't think we have enough data to suggest that it is. In terms of accountability, I would say it's a way for you to document that you were doing work. It's a way for you to encounter a client without them being in your office, without a phone call, which used to be the second level of intervention, right? If you couldn't get to someone face-to-face, you could always talk to them and assess their voice, right? That's part of psychosocial assessment. I remember, and to this day, I can sense crisis, right? For those of you who've done that on the phone, you can hear in someone's voice if they're in distress. If I'm reading a virtual encounter and there's an email or a text sort of mode of communication, one, I can't hear the voice, so that I lose something there. And two, text is subject to interpretation. So if I could interpret a client as being in crisis, that may or might not be true. And also, a client could misinterpret what I'm saying. I may be able to prevent a crisis if I can get the face-to-face interaction. So it's definitely food for thought as we're becoming so adjusted to sort of moving into a world where we're doing more and more of this as a profession. So now it's not only our idea that we're accountable just to public health, but it's accountable to being social work professionals in general, and our accountability to society, no matter what area of practice you're in, whether it's public health or child welfare or mental health. I'm going to say that personally I am resistant to moving too fast. I think we lose part of our practice behavior, and I also think we lose part of why we came into this business, which is to work with people, and going back to that value of human relationships, and going back to the idea of dignity and worth. Is this the best service that we can provide, or is this just a service? So I always say I'm not in the business of providing a service. I want to provide the best service, that's social justice, the best one that we can, given the resources that we have. It may not be, the best that's available anywhere, but it's the best that we can do with our resources. So let's not try to, I always say, don't water it down until we have to. Now, if you think about the idea of boundary relationships, which is, again, number one, and we'll go back to this, and I understand they have their notes, so if you're looking at your notes, and you think about the idea of a boundary relationship within a digital space. So let's think about the app Facebook, right? How do you network within a Facebook app? What do? You send a friend request, right? So if you think about that in terms of clients, client does not equivocate to friend, right? So I think that in some ways answers itself, right? There's an inherent opportunity there for a client to misunderstand your role in their life if you're friends with a client over in a social media space. There's also an opportunity there for a client to have personal information about you that you may or may not have disclosed within a face-to-face session. So that goes back to looking at photos. And I think there's a clear issue there because in virtual space, because of the anonymity, you're not looking at people face-to-face. You're not getting that communication. So you're not able to set that boundary relationship on the spot. So if and this happens to me with students, and it's happened to me many times with clients, can I be your friend on Facebook? And so my first response is, well, I don't have that. And my second response is, I did, but I got off because it just got to be too overwhelming. And the third response is, no, I don't think that's appropriate given our relationship. Maybe when you graduate, if you're a student, I might allow that. Or maybe, and if it's a client, my rule, and this is one that I would think is probably a good rule of thumb, is once a client, always a client, right? There's so much opportunity there in social work, and it's always been hard for us to maintain our anonymity. I know many of you all, if you're like me, you've been in the grocery store or somewhere in public where you see a consumer and they know who you are and they'll approach you and they automatically want that casework because you're just so good, right? That's when we're good at our face-to-face interactions. That's when we know we've done our job in one way because the consumer's coming after us for more. But in another way, it's also an opportunity to say, well, I'm here at the grocery store on personal time, and this could probably wait until our next visit. And while a consumer may interpret that as you being a little bit too forward, the idea is that's the right thing to do. The right thing to do is to set that boundary, to affirm that you're glad that you're able to provide a service, but also to say that you're not available to them all the time. And you don't want to lose the time that you're there. The grocery store is one thing. Your kid's soccer game is something else, right? You don't want to lose time where you should be present in another space, right, because you're having to engage a client in a non-work related interaction that could be handled when they have scheduled time on your calendar. So, but part of that goes back to the virtual age where we're always available, right? We're always linked in. And so I think as a culture and in our society, we sort of transition that just a little bit to where, well, if I can't reach you by text or phone, and if it's face-to-face, you're still available. So if I'm always available to a client by email, then they have no reason to assume that I'm not available to them whenever they see me anywhere, whether it conflicts with my time or not, right? I'm the one who sets that boundary. So if I can set a virtual boundary, then I can set a face-to-face boundary or vice versa. So I use Facebook as my example. I know there are many, avenues now with Twitter and Snapchat and I forget what all. I do actually sound like an old person. I forget what all the apps are. There's so many opportunities there to have that relationship, but Facebook, in fact, uses the word friend. So I think that I think it makes it easy for us to say that, yes, there's an opportunity there for a boundary relationship to exist that's inappropriate, and also an opportunity for a client to have access to information that may or may not otherwise be disclosed. So, I mean, you have that there if you're using good common sense. If a client approaches you in a way that's inappropriate in a digital space, and there's even one piece of information that you wouldn't have shared with them in the office, then you have your answer, right, beyond that. And certainly for those of us, I mean, it goes back to for those of us who have minors in our homes, we have to protect our own identity. In some ways, we have to protect the identity of our family and friends, right? Social work, again, coming with that child welfare background, you're not always a welcome guest. You may not, just because you know your client's address does not mean they need access to your address, right? That's a big personal issue. So when we talk about Google searching, I think we alluded on this earlier in the idea of informed consent. In fact, I don't know of a policy. Renee, you can correct me, and if we find one, we'll print some retraction somewhere. There is no current policy anywhere that says that you cannot do this. The social work police are not going to come after you and say, why in the world did you Google this client? And I talked about that in terms of HR. In fact, someone who is involved with hiring faculty at a university, we do source this information when we hire new faculty. I think that's considered standard practice now. The issue is, though, if you're putting information online and someone else is able to access that, can you make that information go away? And your digital footprint, as a rule of thumb, is about 10 years old. So there are actually agencies now who can access information that's even been pulled down. So even if you're monitoring your own social identity, in fact, probably if it's ever been out or online at any point, then it can probably be accessed. And so I think about this in terms of our obligation to the profession. So let's say you do have a social media presence, right? Let's say you do have a space where you put, I work for the Alabama Department of Public Health. We are getting paid by taxpayer dollars. Alabama citizens are footing the bill. So if there's anything that's unbecoming of the department or of the social work profession, then that can be considered an ethical issue for you, right? So we have to really think long and hard about that, right? Because it is a personal thing. It's something you're doing after hours. Or on the clock, maybe, in most machines. But the idea is, if you're putting something in a space where someone else can see it, and it's something you wouldn't want the world to see, or other people who maybe even don't know you, you should be really cautious about that, right? And we see more and more, I get into these conversations with students, but I can tell you the supervisors are saying we're seeing more and more complaints, more and more, sort of having to deal with ethical issues than we have ever seen before. So it's just a word of caution. And going back to clients, if you're accessing their information, they're giving their consent to put their pictures or their information online when they put it on that space. But is that information going to strongly influence your practice? In other words, do you need it? It's a very gray area. Or could it be misinterpreted in some way? Because remember, it's always easy to misinterpret something that's not said face-to-face because you lose part of the assessment with that. Yes?
I had a question related to this specifically. When we're out in public, there's the potential that somebody could take our picture or put our picture out there on their page or on their website, and certainly we know their cameras are everywhere.
That's right.
You just have to watch the morning news to see the traffic lights and the traffic cameras and whatnot. So, any thoughts there?
This has become a big, big issue, especially and this will be a little bit of a side conversation, so I'll give you the briefest answer I can. I always refer to my brain as a social worker's brain, and that just means that this brain, because it's been in this business for 18 years, thinks about things a little differently than people who aren't members of our profession, particularly in terms of issues of child safety. So if someone is taking my photo or taking a picture of my child and they're putting it on a public space, and I don't want it on my public space and they don't have my permission to do it, I think I am well within my rights. I don't know that there's a policy anywhere that says you can and can't, but I think I'm well within my personal rights to say that I did not give you permission to put this here, please take it down. And I have done that. Recently I had a student at an event who saw myself and my child, and she took a picture and she said, can I publish that? And I almost said, no, you can't take the picture. She asked my permission first, and I was very sort of hesitant, but I said, no, we really like to be the ones to make those decisions. Now, on the one hand, that comes across, I think, with this generation as a little offensive, right? Because people are so now, I think it's become sort of a cultural phenomenon that we're documenting every move we make, and that we have everyone's, virtual permission to take pictures and post at our leisure, but that's really not true. You still have to protect your personal space. So my personal opinion is that you're always well within your rights, if it's someone who's taking a photograph of you or anyone in your family, to say, please don't put that in a public space. Please don't post that. I chose not to do that. I think that becomes a personal space issue. And again, that goes back to the face-to-face, right? Because when it's in a virtual space, there's a lot of anonymity there, right? You're not having to actually ask permission. It can go on very quickly. You can snap a picture and it goes online, and there's really no asking process. Where it used to be, before we had digitals and we actually had photos of our kids in our wallets and our purses, if someone wanted a photo of your child, you had to cut it out. Remember, we all got those, and you gave it to them. So you gave your permission in that moment. You said, here's this photo. You're one of the people that I'm going to allow to have a photo of my family. Now, that's the way we look at that as a culture has changed dramatically. And so I think the only thing that we can do is sort of respect our own personal space enough to tell someone else that they've crossed that line. And that's certainly true with clients. I would never, ever advise someone to, now if a client, they can do whatever they want, but I would never advise someone to allow a client to photograph them in session, in an office or when they're in public or at an event, because I think that can be misconstrued because, I have photos of my social worker online. And that may be great in certain moments. Students at graduation, okay. A mental health client that I'm seeing in my private practice that's confidential, no. Right, so you just have to I always call it a person and situation assessment. And you're responsible for establishing the boundary. You're the one who's professional. And certainly, if it's a personal issue, if it's your personal photo, then that's at your discretion ultimately in any way. And that's just that has a lot to do with caution, but also has a lot to do with the fact that I have that social worker's brain. So I think about where this is going and what this could do, and is this going to influence my family in any way, and particularly with those of us who have minors in our homes, or even if you have you have a kid that you say in college, you still might want to be, that's something that we might want to look at. Does that answer the question?
Well, and then going back to it, once it's
traffic cameras, I don't know.
Well, once it's on, once it's on the internet, it's always there.
So there's always going to be that issue of the question is, even if I ask you to pull it down, the digital footprint could still be 10 years old. So if someone were looking for it, they would in fact have access to information without your permission. And that I think now it's become, social worker brain talking, one of the dangers of our world, one of the things we have to be cautious about that we didn't have to be cautious about 10 years ago because the resources have changed so much. So yes, and I think that even more so suggests the need for establishing clear and ever-present personal and professional boundaries. Because in my mind, that's one of the only ways to control that. So I think now sort of that behavior that's listed as number 1 by CSWE, which is, establish boundaries and follow ethics, I think now bleeds into our personal lives more than it used to in so many ways. And so I think it's good food for thought for those of you who are watching. Everybody now is going to be looking at their phones and computers and not watching this and making sure everything's restricted, right? Sometimes I see the other social worker brains, you can sort of see the dominoes falling when I do these trainings for large audiences because we start to really think about that.
There's also an issue with that, something similar to that, is of clients wanting to take pictures of us maybe with their new baby or whatever.
Yeah, sure.
Within the clinic setting, we don't know who else may end up in that photograph, and it could end up being a HIPAA violation because it ends up on Facebook, and then all of a sudden the whole town knows that so-and-so was in the health department that day because they were standing behind you.
And,
So,
and Renee Carpenter was their social worker beyond
Right.
that. And she's my neighbor.
And,
so, and your kid may go to the same school. So it sort of unlocks, all these other issues. And I've had social workers, when I've done these trainings, say that our anonymity is important because, if you are a probation officer or you are a child welfare worker or you are a therapist, at the group home or you are a public health worker in the hospital and your kid's in the same classroom with one of your consumers, then they don't need to know that information both ways. Maybe your child doesn't need to know the information, you're protecting them, but also the consumer doesn't need to know. Right, so there could be some intersection there. And so families are getting really cautious, social work families are becoming more cautious about that. Because especially in Alabama, where we tend to be a rural state, towns are small, it's always been difficult for social workers to maintain any sort of anonymity in this profession in any way. But now we're seeing sort of more of that. It's been elevated. And I have had social workers tell me, I had a student tell me who had a father who was a director of one of our state agencies, and he said, my dad never talked to me about what he did. Because he worked in a business where he wanted, his son to be sort of protected from that until he was old enough to understand the nature of the business, and I get that, right? Because we don't always deal with those families that don't have social workers, sort of going back to the initial part of that. And so I agree, it's so hard now, and again, it goes back to a consumer, a young mother who's proud and who, it sort of goes back to a moral violation almost, because if you're looking at the social worker for some of our moms is one of the most important people in their lives. They may have a healthy pregnancy and a healthy birth because you were involved in their life. And that's a proud moment, and they may want to capture it, and that's important to them. So you want them to have that. And it used to be that when it was a photo that you handed them, they had it, and that was the only one, but now it's become another issue. And so we almost have to become more constricted and find that balance between still being humanistic and doing the work that we've always done and doing it the way we've done it, the quality, but also still controlling for that. And it's a boundary issue, and you may just have to get accustomed to saying, it's okay for you to do this, but, there are some rules, but we don't really have the rules. We don't have them. And if it's a HIPAA violation, we have HIPAA. We have that rule, which is sort of a ubiquitous rule. It covers everything. And it's much easier to violate that than it used to be. So,
Also easier to manipulate pictures.
Yes.
Right.
You had that picture that was a hard copy, the Polaroid with the horrible print, whatever, but now you can take that digital picture and you can add people in, and you can do all kinds of things with it. So
and post it without anyone's permission.
Certainly.
So, and we go down this road. This is the point in the training where we start to get sort of the most information or the most feedback from the audience, because everyone seems to have encountered an ethical dilemma. And the old ones, what I would say, we knew what to do. There were so many times where we knew what to do about an ethical dilemma. You knew if a client was in crisis that you had a duty to warn, or you had a duty to report, or you had a duty to intervene. But these sort of gray area issues, you don't always know what to do, because we haven't generated the policies that suggest the 1, 2s, 3s, and 4s. And so our social workers are in fact vulnerable because they have to make a decision in real time. And there's a sensitivity there when you're telling a young mother, no, you can't photograph me, I'm sorry. You're just going to have to, be in this moment and know that I was here and create a memory, where we used to not have to say that. It used to be very different. And I can remember working in child welfare, and you might have had a photo as a part of the record. You had one. It didn't leave the office. That was the photo. If you left the office and your case went to someone else, that's how they knew the identity of the client. That's what the purpose of that was. And so that's really changed over time. It's really changed substantially. And if we think about shared computer in offices, that's sort of going down the list, there have been some issues with, not everyone, I can remember not everyone having a personal machine in their office or at home. And so we shared a lot of machines, and now we have a lot of access virtually. So we have computer labs in some of our, you can apply for things online, you can use, but be very careful about looking at histories. And there was an encounter that I read as I was doing some of the research for this when I started it 2 years ago, about machines that were shared, and a social worker had been online and had actually searched for a client to get information, and the history was there, and the client came in to fill out the form and could see, sort of the issue. There had been no law violation there. Like, again, the police, it was okay, but the idea was it ethical to do that, and what kind of message did that send to that client where they knew that information had been accessed? Right? It wasn't the best thing to do. It probably wasn't the right thing to do, but depending on the situation, you never know. And so it's just sort of being careful about shared machines, being careful about, clients having access to, we want them to have access to resources. We want them to have access to our libraries. We want them to have access to information. We want them to be able to fill out our forms. But just make sure if there's a form online and clients are sharing, that the last client that was there that was entering that HIPAA information, that form's not captured in some way, so the next one pulls it up and go, oh yeah, well there's Jason's form. Right now I have all this protected held information. Right, so just make sure that if you're doing that kind of service, that the machine knows to clear. Does that make sense? So clear those forms and get that out. And we've seen that sort of a lot of, ethical dilemmas that were sort of done so inadvertently, and accidentally, but it still is an issue if a client suggests that you violated their privacy in any way. And it's certainly an issue if it gets to a point where there's a HIPAA violation involved. And I would say that leaving clients' forms, just like it used to be, right? If you left a form in the lobby, that can be considered a HIPAA violation if it was laying around and the public had access to it. Same thing with our machines, but we tend to think about them so much differently. And then when we think about material, we're resource brokers. That's part of that's old language. That's part of what we do in social work, is we're not all one-stop shops. That's why we're departments of health and public health and child welfare. We get into our areas of practice, but we all depend on one another systemically to do the work all the time. And so if you're referring a client to a resource, and particularly if you're working with a younger client, so you're talking about a young parent, they're very, very comfortable going and reading information by phone, looking at it online. And if you're the referral source, then you're responsible for what you're referring the client to. And we go back to when we used to, have the brochures, and you had them all, and you knew which ones were your favorites and the ones that you checked out. Well, now we do that kind of resourcing online. And so if you're sending a client to a web link, please make sure you've done the work to ensure that that's a quality site. And please make sure you're using those teachable moments that occur in social work where you can talk to a client about what's not a good site. This is not a good source of information for you. I understand that you found this, and I understand that someone else wrote this, but this is not a qualified professional. This is not someone who has the authority to assess. This is not someone who's trained in this area. So you can use those moments in your office as teachable moments where I can still remember the old photos, where we had the brochures and we were showing the clients, sort of like this, everything we wanted them to know. Well, that's changed just a little bit. So now we have to be ever more sort of aware of the idea of referring a client to a resource, even if it's an online resource. I have found that they're going to come in with that. I've been online and then introduce a conversation. So then you take the teachable moment there. Well, show me what you've read. Let's look at this and let's talk about what you think, and here's the services we can offer. And even we know now that even within our own protected sites, clients can still misinterpret information. That's why we're here, to explain to them what services are available, whether or not they're qualified, how they're delivered, how long, right, and how much. That's why we're trained. That's what we're trained to do here, is provide those services. And we never want to get to a point where we're letting clients, especially with the WebMD and other things, letting clients come to us and tell us what they are. Because then we're losing our practicability, like we're losing our scope of practice. All right, so we'll talk a little bit. I know now we're running out of time, so I'm glad that we took the break early. So we're going to go through your identity now, and so we're going to talk about your vulnerability as someone who's in a professional discipline. We talked in the lead-in lecture about you're responsible, once you identify yourself as a social worker, you're responsible for our profession, to adhering to the values of social work. So if you're putting online and you're using your own personal space and it's your online identity we're working with now, and you put that you're a social worker, then you're adherent to the values of our profession. If you put you work for the Department of Public Health, then you're adherent to the policies and the values and all the other auspices of the Department of Public Health, right? You're representing them in your online identity, even if you're off the Social Work Department and Public Health's webpage. That's one way. That's part of your online identity. We can't control that, right? Now it's become a referral source. So most of us probably have our contact information at work somewhere in the world, and people can find it. And that's something we can't control. But what we can control is what we're doing or out of the office. And so your online identity matters. Because if someone goes to the University of Montevallo and sees my name as a professor, they can do all kinds of things with that. First of all, they can see if I have an online identity, find out information, right? They also can go to the board and see if I'm licensed, say if I am who I say I am. That's okay too. They may be able to look up a publication to see if that checks out. And so you have to know that once someone sees your name on a public space and you're associated with this department, it is so easy to enter that and find out. And you could enter Renee Carpenter Public Health, and I bet I could pull up any number of pieces of information. Okay? So just know that that's part of your protection, is to be aware of that. And also, I hate to use the word policing, but I do think it comes across as that, is that we have to monitor ourselves and scrutinize what we're putting out there, because we represent our profession and our jobs, our places of employment. And certainly anything that does go online that may be unbecoming in any way can not only impact your employment here at Public Health, but it can impact employment opportunities anywhere, because as someone who, again, does HR work for the university, people do source that out. There's no policy that suggests that you can at this point. And when you use those professional boundaries and you're monitoring your online identity, I think that sort of being ever aware and ever present of personal boundaries, and now personal boundaries have actually extended themselves into a virtual world. So what I'm asking you to do is be aware of personal boundaries in a not personal space. I realize that's counterintuitive, but that's really what the suggestion is. I think that's the bring home of that, is to be aware of those boundaries and sort of use a rule that if you wouldn't shout it out loud, then you might not want to put it into a space where other people can read it out loud. And once you identify sort of the online and third-party postings, I think that place of employment is one thing, and being responsible to social work is another. But there have also been issues with third-party postings for people who have open spaces. And, if someone else posts to a public space of yours or says something that's counterintuitive to the values of our profession, are you held responsible for that? No, that's the person who posted it's responsibility, but it is reflective. Right, it's associated with you and your name. It's something you need to control, something you need to pull down, something you might want to suggest. And again, remember, in the lead-in, it all sort of ties in. Not everyone has social work values. I have friends in my life who are non-social work professionals who don't subscribe to the values of the social work profession. That's their choice, right? Just like it was my choice to become a social worker, right? To embrace the values, right? We can't control that. But I certainly could control the conveying of that information in a space that's associated with my name, right? So that's something I would want to control. So we have to be sort of aware of that. And I think, as we get into an election year, it'll become more and more apparent. People start to share things much more readily, and you start to hear a lot more dialogue go on, and all kinds of things get, filtered around. And it's really easy, to clog up a virtual space. So just make sure that you're monitoring that. It becomes a cleaning issue. It also becomes one more thing to do. And it's sort of going back to that idea that as if it hasn't historically been challenging to be a social worker, and ethical dilemmas have not always been ever present. Now we're adding an additional layer, and for some of us it adds an additional layer of time. So if you're thinking about your own online identity, you need to think about it in terms of the cleanup that's involved with that. Do you want to dedicate the time that it's going to take to monitor the space and clean it up, to monitor the friends, or to keep the network small? Right? So if you're thinking about, a friendship request, it should really be synonymous with that. So maybe small groups are a little easier to control than having that. But our generation tends not to feel that way. That tends to be something that's more specific to us. And it's not that I'm giving personal opinion on this. This is learned through the navigation of this new cultural phenomenon into the world of work. Right? This generation is now entering the world of work. So that's what has generated this training in so many ways for those of us who were in a space where we didn't have that, but now we do. So we're sort of learning in that context. And so we talked about self-disclosure. We talked about the digital footprint. The general rule of thumb is 10 years. So once something becomes, virtually available, even if you take it down, you should never assume that it's down forever. And you should also never assume that it's completely private. Even though your settings are set to private, I get that. It in some ways is not. Right? If it's in a space where other people can see it, then you're going to have a hard time because it becomes the share. So I had a social worker who said, it told me that she lived in a small town as I was doing one of these trainings, and she very, very closely monitors her online identity. But one of the things she said is, but it doesn't take people long to find somebody who does know me, who is connected. And, I have to be really cautious about what I put out there because I don't want my consumers to have photos of my children, to be frank, because I feel like that compromises our relationship. Right? Because, we aren't always welcome guests in so many ways. So we have to be really cautious, and it's not just about our own online identity and representing, the profession and representing Alabama and representing taxpayers, right? It becomes about the representation, our biggest job, which is keeping our own families safe and keeping our own resources met and sort of looking out for those of us that matter the most. And you should never sort of compromise that in any way. And the idea that the social worker was trying to get off to me was I didn't do that, but it happened inadvertently. So it sort of opens another layer, and that's why I say when I have a social worker's brain, that's how my brain is starting to operate. Sort of being cautious, and we've always had to be cautious, but sort of adding another layer, which for some of us, if you're me, is a little bit tedious. So when I said earlier that I've opted out of a certain, social media account, that's the reason why, because it just became a little bit more upkeep. All right, so when we look at your own online identity, a little bit of a tongue twister there. If you're using online sites for social networking with outside client access, so if you subscribe to an online or an app where there's opportunity for online networking, whether it be a dating site, whatever it is, that clients also have that same opportunity to do that. So you also have to now be aware that clients have, and I read this on a blog, so this is not validated research, but I would say that the person seemed to be convincing, and social workers, I believe, are honest. They worked in a mental health agency, and they were using a very common online dating site, and were just so humanistic in their values that they were matched with someone who was a consumer of service at the agency who was seeking out someone with those same values. It happened unless it was a total fabrication, but when I saw it, I had never thought of it in that way. And when I do the training, I tell the story because I see people out there going, wow, I've never thought of that in that way. Just know that in a consumer sort of economy, if you can access and subscribe to a site, that the people that we work with also can do that very same thing. So I'm not discouraging online behavior in any way. What I am saying is be cautious, and you just have to know. And that goes back to the whole idea. It used to be that informed consent was such a simple process. I remember doing my first research, and informed consent was everything on this paper, and you sign it, and we're not going to do anything else but what we've outlined right here in this informed consent document. And that's really not the way the world operates now. And it wasn't that long ago that I was in that position. It was 10 years. The world has changed so much in 10 years. So if you're social networking, just please, be mindful of that, right? Because you're putting information out in a space where others can see it. And they can actually be inadvertently connected, apparently, in some ways. And so that goes back to proper use of privacy and security settings and sort of monitoring your own postings and thinking about where you are and sort of the updates of things. And particularly for those of you, just sort of as a caution, is that if you have underage minors, you really need to be monitoring their device use as well, because they can link into clients and consumers and not know that they're clients and consumers, right? Because of the anonymity that we have to have for our clients. So, if you do have 5 clients in your kid's classroom at school or in your kid's school, so they're not all in the same class, that's a little much. But if they're all in the same school, and your son or daughter doesn't know that that individual or those individuals are consumers of your services, that can be compromising, because they may have access to your family vacation photos that were posted by someone else that they know as a peer in school. And we want our kids and our clients to be as normalized as we possibly can, but this has sort of changed the way we think about that. So more of the same. All right, so I go back. This is an old framework. This is really the last thing we talk about. I'm going to move through it quickly, and I'm going to try to leave Renee 5 minutes open. So the old framework, and this is Madison. This is sort of classic to me. This is something I use every semester, and I typically say, don't use antiquated work. But her framework is so interesting to me. So you think about the idea of an ethical dilemma, particularly with a new social worker who has not been in practice. Sort of having a 1, 2, 3, 4 is always helpful, sort of looking at those models of practice. And when you have an ethical dilemma and you're making, unless it's something you have to make person in time, person in space, whatever, you can take time to gather the information and really document now the ethical concerns and the practice considerations. So in other words, what do social work ethics suggest that I do as best practice? Right, while also keeping the client safe. And we know that's why we have dilemmas, right? Because clients, we want them to be empowered, but sometimes they may not be completely satisfied with the services that we offer. But if it's in their best interest, we need to enforce that. And also being mindful of any value tensions. Just sort of looking and sort of being interpersonal, so to speak, and sort of being sort of centered in yourself. And if there is a value tension that you're experiencing, allow yourself the space to process through it. Sort of create that internal dialogue that's, why am I feeling tense? Do I feel like this client, there may be an ethical issue here for me. Let me think about this. Let's really exercise our abilities to do analysis the way we do with others. And sometimes it's hard to turn that prism inward just a little bit and say, where's this value tension coming from? And certainly if there's a supervisor available, bounce that off. Sort of take that opportunity to really think about that value tension. That's why we have supervision in place. Talk to your supervisors about why, and if they would have an issue with this, would the organization have an issue with this? What is your take on this? And right now, because policy is so gray in this area, it's helpful to have the dialogues professionally, because that may help all of us understand how we should respond in the future. The policies are being written in real time as we're doing this training right now. And then also think about those principles and go back. And I know for many of us, it's been years and years and years. We sort of, what I say is we memorize the values a long time ago, but we practice them every day and they become intuitive, right? And we just do it. And so we may have forgotten, that they're listed, the 7 values in that order, but we just become so, qualified and proficient in our practice wisdom. We just practice empathy, and we practice social justice, and we practice, valuing all human relationships. But think about those values. If there is a value tension, think about the social justice of the issue. Think about, would making a decision right now influence a client's life? And we want to influence it in the most productive way that we can, given the resources that we have, and sort of thinking about the benefit and cost, which seems like a business model, but with any dilemma, that's why it's a dilemma. Because there's going to be a negative consequence potentially somewhere. And this also goes back to those licensing questions. The question I get, and I finally figured it out, is that why are they all written, what should you do first, what would be the most appropriate? Because we love that word, but there's no real definition of appropriate. But the idea is ethical dilemma is that. You don't always have a black or white concrete policy that says this is what you do for this situation right now today. You have to make a person in situation assessment. So that's why those questions are written that way. And that's what exercises our brains in terms of thinking about social work practice. And so there may never be a list of 10 rules that you can never violate with regard to your online identity. But there is going to always be the suggestion that the person who's responsible for establishing their own sort of personal and professional boundary issue with that is you. It's not going to come back on the client. It's always going to come back on the professional, because that's part of our job, right? That's part of our job, is to be ethically centered. And not everyone is trained in social work, and not everyone is going to know those values. And in fact, they shouldn't. That's something that corresponds with our professional skill set. And then sort of thinking about resolution and implementation. And sort of we do, I think, these things really quickly. I sort of can do these 8 things now sort of in my head, but it's sort of going back and looking at it more concretely now as we were having new ethical dilemmas, which is what I call this. The old ones we could work through pretty quickly, but now we're having new ones, and that's a big challenge for all of us, particularly as those of us who have been in the business a while are training a new generation of social workers, right, who are working with their chronological peers, right? So the training is going to sort of be both ways. So we're training the professionals, and we want them to be aware of the challenges of being a social worker and the value of ethical practice, right? The value of treating clients always respectfully. And even if it's an uncomfortable moment to set a boundary, if you're acting in the best interest of the client, then you're covered by our code of ethics, because that's what we're trained to do, right? So just think about that. My small audience, and we have 4 minutes. I'm looking at the clock.
Okay.
Does anybody have a question for me?
Have any questions come in?
No? Questions from the audience? I have one more slide then, and we can get back on time. This is, right, so I think now, and what I've been suggesting for people because I've gotten so much qualitative data as I've been doing these training across the state, I could write a case book just on ethical dilemma, I think now, just from hearing from the social workers from the various areas of practice, is that I think we've reached a point where the person in situation assessment has become so much more important with regard to ethical dilemma, and taking time. I say it's contemplative practice, which is taking the time to think, even though we tend to be in a culture that suggests we should know everything in the moment and be able to push it out. I think that's an impossibility. I don't want to see our profession get to a point where it is so rudimentary that it becomes, that there's less critical thinking involved rather than more critical thinking involved. So I always say, if you're confronted with an ethical dilemma, there's a synapse there. You can take a pause. Even though someone may be commanding an answer from you immediately, there's a synapse there. So you're the one who controls whether or not you push out that answer, right? So take pause and think critically about what would be the best thing to do, and also reserve the right to seek outside counsel. That's why we have supervision in place. That's why social work has supervision in place. That's why we have to supervise our licensees. That's why we have a bureaucratic organization. Despite the challenges that bureaucracy presents to us, the way the system is set up suggests that there are going to be people who come in who are not going to have all the training in the world, and there are going to be seniors who do, who have been in the agency longer and who have learned, like I have, how to practice in time and develop their own practice wisdom. And you have to take those teachable moments and share them. And for me, supervision, the most meaningful supervision has been in the practice wisdom stage, where someone who's done the work is telling me, what they've learned from their practice. So sort of remain open when there's an ethical dilemma and you're confronted with that. Think about each side of the conversation. Be a good psychosocial assessment person. Be attentive, but not legalistic. All right, and I realize that legalistic listening to me is someone who, before you can get the ethical dilemma out, they're telling you what the policy says. We want to always follow policy in every way, but we also want to listen, and especially now, because it's different if you have a policy that says 1, 2, 3, here's what you do, but if there isn't a concrete policy, and at this point with regard to online dating, there's not. You have to listen closely. So, listen attentively. Don't listen legalistically. Don't listen in terms of litigation, but listen to the problem, because that's what we're trained to do, right? We're trained to be problem solvers. So listen to the new worker, or listen to your colleague, because again, you're responsible to your colleagues just like you're responsible to your clients, just like you're responsible to the department and to society, because those are the people who pay our salaries, right? We're state employees. I work for the University of Montevallo, so I'm a state employee just like you guys. So we're responsible to the public in so many ways. So listen to what they have to say and then use ethics to guide your decision making like we've always been taught to do. All right? And I think that will give us enough time to close. So I'll give it back to Renee and let her close the session for us.
Do we have any questions coming in? All right. Well, thank you so much for
My
bringing that.
pleasure.
You've given us a lot to think about. And I do want to reiterate what he said also about supervision. Everybody in the health department has a supervisor. So please always consult your supervisor, and your supervisor is going to consult the code as well with you. So thank you for joining us today, and until next time, we will see you on the Alabama Public Health Training Network.